I've got something kind of esoteric for all my string player friends. It's kind of cool. It's kind of useful. It works live, and it uses tools you probably already have in your DAW. The use of the humble impulse response file is nothing new to the world of electric guitarists and so forth, but it's something that a lot of bowed string players don't tend to know about. They're pretty great. I mean, you use them as a guitarist to simulate cabinets and amplifiers, and a lot of us use them without really being aware of it in the form of reverbs and even some other like speaker simulators. But pretty much any acoustic space can be made into an impulse response file, and one of those acoustic spaces can be the inside of an acoustic violin or an acoustic cello or an acoustic guitar. Like I said, guitarists have used this trick for a while. They load up IRs of acoustic guitars and then play an electric guitar through it, and it sounds reasonably like an acoustic guitar. There are some IRs out now that are acoustic violins and acoustic cellos and basses and violas. And if you're someone like me who plays electric violin, and you want an acoustic sound, especially in like a live setting where you have to worry about things like feedback and all that jazz, they can be super handy. And what's kind of cool is pretty much every DAW already has an IR loader in the form of a convolution reverb these days. So you can use a convolution reverb in full wet mode with one of these impulse response files and get a pretty decent result. And I'm going to show you how that works. I got my trusty Steinberger here. I don't have an acoustic cello to demonstrate. I mean, I know some electric cellists, but I do have another Steinberger electric violin that's strung up as a baritone. So it's in roughly the same sort of sonic territory. And it's deep and low, and it sounds pretty good run through the cello IR, and I'm going to demonstrate that. So I've got a session loaded up here. I've got an IR loaded into Space Designer because I'm a Logic user, so I've got Space Designer as a impulse response convolution thing. There are some free ones you can get that work pretty darn well. I know STL Tones has a free one. I think it's called Ignite, and that works great. I think I use that one in my live rig. But, I'm here in Logic. Might as well use what I've already got. So I've got this Italian Violin 1A from 3 Sigma, which is an organization that or company, or I'm not exactly sure what they are, but they're a website that just sells impulse responses of various kinds, and they've got acoustic bowed stringed instruments, they've got guitars, they've got cabinets, they got all sorts of crazy stuff. Basically, I've turned off everything except the dry and wet mix here. I want a little bit of the dry signal to come through on this one, but not a whole lot. Well, full wet, so you get that glorious resonance, but I've turned off the volume envelope because I don't care about that here, and I've turned off the filter envelope because I don't care about that here. I've added a little bit of output EQ, just a little cut on the high. That's just my own personal preference. I could mess around with that more on if I wanted to, but I just haven't felt the need to. But of course, first thing we're going to need is some source material. So I've got my old electric violins, and I've recorded a few things. All my cellist friends are probably going to hate me for this. So here's the absolute dry recording. So you can tell it's kind of rubbery. It's just the straight output of that piezo pickup. It sounds violin-ish, but it lacks the chamber resonance and all that good stuff. And I mean, that's fine for some applications. If you're doing something that requires a lot of effects, you don't want a whole lot of chamber resonance because that'll mess with your effects and your feedbacks and all that good stuff. But if you want a more acoustic sound, but you're playing an electric violin, you load up this IR, and it sounds a little different. So, same recording, just added some effects. I tried to gain match it because there's always some gain differences. So if you just swap back and forth between the two. Yeah, so it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it can certainly be finessed some. And then you do stuff like add reverb to it, and you get a much more set in a space acoustic sound. So that's how that works. And, you know, it's just simple impulse response. Just loaded this IR straight into Space Designer, turned off most of the envelopes, and I'm pretty much good to go. For the quote-unquote cello, it's a little different. Let's mute the reverb so you can hear that. This one has a probably an even more pronounced effect. Here's the dry. So switch it over to the wet. Sounds a lot more acoustic. Again, not perfect, but it's not terrible. The only tricky thing about this particular impulse response is I did have to alter the input gain as well as the output levels because it was overdriving the impulse in a very strange way. But that might just be this particular IR. But if I add some reverb and go back and forth, you can hear the difference between dry and wet. So yeah, and you can get really creative with this. You can get impulse responses for other instruments and apply them, and you can get some interesting effects from that. They're not always great effects, but they can work pretty well. And I mean, impulse responses are at the heart of most amp and cabinet modeling. So if you're doing anything with, you know, electric guitar style effects, there's a good chance you're already using them. But if you're not, yeah, this is a good way to start out. If you want to do this without having to use a DAW, there are actual pedals, and there are profiling amplifiers like the Kemper and a few others. I think the Line 6 has one that does this as well, where you can load impulse response files into your amplifier or into the pedal and use that as a hardware effect in your effects chain. The other thing with the cello one, just I've brought in a lot more dry signal than I normally would because it's a very sort of aggressive impulse response. But anyway, I was clipping. It has a lot of uses, and the latency is pretty good, especially like Space Designer is kind of designed for it. I'm using this in Ableton with STL Ignite, but I have also used the Ableton Convolution Reverb, which has very low latency, very good performance. Modern processors don't seem to choke on this stuff like they used to. I wouldn't run, a dozen of these at once, but a couple of them work just great. They don't tax my CPU much at all. If I were running like, a 15-year-old i3, that's a problem. But this is an M1 in this one, and it doesn't even tick over. So impulse response is super useful.